Free will. This is probably, if not the one of the most complex topics for me personally.
Sure.
Kind of wrapping my head around. With free will, obviously, at the very least, our will is very limited compared to what we feel like how much will we have. We have these experiments. I forget the guy's name that did initially the experiments, the big ones where we like make decisions before we're aware of them consciously. They've done testing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I just read Sapolsky's book, Determined, and he makes really good points. About, again, because cause, we don't really know everything about cause. At the deepest level, but it seems like everything we know, all of our actions are kind of determined by previous things. Like everything is, you know. So he goes like from whether it's minutes ago, uh, years ago, or even going back to the culture you're born in, and so everything about all the decisions you make, they're determined by other things, really. Even if you feel like you're free. What is your position on that, on free will? Because I go back to Sean Carroll, and like one of the things in his book where he gets more into philosophy at the end, he taught, and what he says is actually kind of true, because he says basically you have levels, right? And at the fundamental level, there is no free will, but on the emergent level, we can say we have free will, and it makes sense to talk like that. Okay, but it doesn't really address whether or not what people care about, if their will is free or how free. It doesn't really address. Oh, we feel like it at this level, but it's not there at the fundamental level. Like, okay, but it doesn't really address it. So anyway, what do you think? Do we have free will, or how much do we have? What is your position on that?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, we don't. But there's a lot of nuance here. Everything turns on the definition. When you're asking the question, do we have free will? The first thing we have to ask is, well, what do you mean by free will? What does the phrase mean, right? Because it's all going to turn on that. If you mean a certain thing, then definitely we don't. And if you mean something else, we definitely could, right? And that's where it's Sapolsky, right, that wrote Determined. I think he may have a chapter. I haven't read his book yet, but I think I've heard a couple of interviews with him that I think he has a chapter on this, but I think he underestimates what's called compatibilism, because what compatibilism and what compatibilists would say is that, oh yeah, we agree with everything that you say in your book. It's just that we don't think that's that's what free will is. You think that we lack free will because you define it in a certain kind of way. And when you define it in that way, sure, because of all the things that you lay out in their book, we do not have free will in that sense. But we don't think that's what free will is, right?
I think Sam Harris, I remember I read his book on free will a long time ago. I think he was talking with Daniel Dennett, and they were corresponding. And he said that basically what compatibilists do is they say, like, we found Atlantis because we're looking at Venice, and we're saying Venice is like Atlantis because it has very similar, but that's not what people mean. And it's not actually the same thing.
A independent study with one of my graduating seniors, and his paper was on free will, and he brought up that exact same example with the Atlantis example, right? I use in the lectures, I'm rewriting for great courses. I'm rewriting my Exploring Metaphysics course right now and expanding it. The example I use is like the Loch Ness Monster, right? If I prove to you the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, and someone said, no, Nessie does exist. Nessie is this big fish that I found in the Loch Ness Monster. It's like, well, you can call that fish Nessie if you want to, but that's not what everyone else is talking about when they say.
So it's about definitions, right?
Right, so. Exactly, right. And so I personally think that's what's going on with compatibilism, that they have this other definition, right? So Harry Frankfurt defines free will as the ability to act in accordance with your second order wants and desires. John Martin Fisher defines free will basically as the ability to act in accordance with a rational deliberation. So as long as you're sensitive to reason and that kind of stuff, and then you have and you're not controlled or something like that, and you go through a rational deliberation and then you decide what to do, that's free, even if the process of that rational determination is completely physical and completely determined. Doesn't matter, Fisher says, right? As long as actually he's backed off that a little bit. I think you would call it backed off. His view is called semi-compatibilism, where he says that if that happens, he's willing to grant that you're not free, but you're still morally responsible for what you do. And those two concepts, freedom and moral responsibility, very much go hand in hand, but he separates them
But
out.
also people get into like society. Well, if you say we don't have free will, like what are you just gonna let murderers run free? Like, no, you still have to protect society. You still lock people up like you would lock up tornadoes if you could, right?
Right.
So definitely society still has a function. We're still social, interconnected social creatures that have to live
Yeah.
together and all that.
And so,
So
and so I actually have a line on this that is somewhat, it's kind of like Fisher's, although it came up before I read Fisher's take on this or whatever. Because that's the thing that people worry about. If there's no free will, then moral responsibility is out the window. We can't, but we can't have any kind of moral evaluation or, but yeah. And I don't think that that's right. So let me give this little nuance. All right. First of all, like you point out, we can still hold people legally responsible for their actions, right? If they're a dangerous society, we can lock them up. We would try to rehabilitate them. If we can't, we keep them locked away. We could use punishment as a deterrent to try to encourage people to live certain ways and to not do certain actions or whatever. We can do all of that even if free will is not a thing, right? That is all perfectly fine. And even if we can't, if there's morality is completely meaningless, if there's no free will, if that is the case, we can still punish and deter and do all of those kinds of things. However, what we can't do, I think, is that we can't hold people morally responsible for what they do. In other words, we can't say shame, 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 and blame people for what they did, because we realize that what they did because their brain has a certain structure, and that brain structure is ultimately outside of their control, right? It's their genetics and environment that make their brain what they do. However, even though we cannot put moral blame onto people, we can't hold them morally responsible, we can morally evaluate them. I can look at someone's character, right? Like when they do a particularly bad action, and I can look at the character they have that caused them to do that action. I can say, oh, that's a morally bad character. That action was morally wrong, and the character they have that made them do that action is a morally bad character that I would not want to have, that I wouldn't want my offspring to have, et cetera, right? We can morally, because we can still use utility, we can still use Kantian deontology, we can still use virtue ethics, we can still do all of those things to do moral evaluations of actions and of people. We can say someone is morally bad, and that's completely different than morally blaming them. And so even if libertarian free will doesn't, and libertarian free will is the kind of free will that people think that we really have, that what we do is ultimately up to us and we could have done otherwise. If that's not true, if what we do is not ultimately up to us and we can't do otherwise, right? We can't lay moral blame, but we can still morally evaluate. And that moral evaluation is what is necessary for kind of all the things that society needs morality to do.
I think it's worth pointing out too that people change. Obviously, change happens and people can change and change in beneficial ways. Because we get changed all the time. It's just a matter of like for me, when I think about it's just kind of luck, right? I happen to come across a certain thing that led me to a certain idea. I'm not responsible for happening to come across that idea. Being the type of person like that has good, strong willpower or work ethic, you not necessarily, there's so many things like your motivation, when it comes, how it comes. You can try, but even your trying and your ability to try, just you keep going back to these chains, like Sapolsky points out, which to me it's a really, I think, the best kind of layout of all this that I've read, just that causal chain, right? There's no magic that stands independently from it. So,
right.
But he also says,
go ahead.
He also says in determine, it's kind of a double meaning, because determine, but also determine in almost a free will sense. You're determined because there's a hopeful future that comes out of this, because things can be more realistic. And when we understand reality better, we have better leverage on our future, even though we're not all free and we can't just magically, do things independently of physics. There can still be positive change when we have accurate understandings of reality. So that's leverage, right? But also it's hopeful because we're more empathetic, right? We have
absolutely right. So it makes us more empathetic, right? So let me return to that. Let me put the same point in a different way, and then we'll turn to the empathy. That understanding that we don't have libertarian free will actually helps us behave better. If we think that we have libertarian free will, if we want to change our behavior, what we think we need to do is just have better willpower. I just need to decide to do it, and my soul up here can just make that decision and effectuate the change. When we realize that that's not how we work, right? That we're actually determined in the way that we do, we realize, oh, what I need to do to change is not just will myself to change. I need to change my circumstance. I need to change my environment so I can change my neural configuration, right, to make it to where I don't do that kind of thing anymore, right? And so it makes us much more likely to succeed in changing our behavior than if we think that we have free will and to change our behavior, we just need to will it into existence, right? And then we can also be more empathetic for others because we realize that the reason that they do what they do, the reason that they perform the immoral actions that they perform, right, it's not ultimately their fault, right? And so we can, that empathy comes from not, saying shame on you, placing that moral blame. Well, we can also realize what we need to do to help them, right, to get out of that. That's why under this view, the penal system would not be retributive, where we try to give people what they deserve. It would all be geared towards rehabilitation, right? Where we're trying to get the person to be a better kind of person. Now, if we can't do that, we still lock them away for protection of society. But the purpose behind punishment would be completely different, and it would be much more empathetic.
Foresight paradigm, fine. A foresight paradigm. Foresight paradigm, you fine. A foresight paradigm. I fight for sight.